Hi, this is Phelan Jones, PJ for short. In Genesis chapter 6, the Bible tells us of a time when the world became very wicked. It says the heart of man was on evil continually. It says that the earth was corrupt before God and that it was filled with violence, or Hamas in Hebrew. And there was a man named Noah, and it says that Noah found grace in the eyes of God. And God told him to build an ark, a big boat, because there was a flood coming that was going to destroy all the evil off the face of the earth. And that he was to bring his family on board, and a pair of each of the unclean animals and 7 of the clean animals on board the ark. And through the ark, that all life on earth would be preserved. Mankind would be preserved through Noah's family, and the animal kingdom would be preserved through all the types of animals, the kinds, as it were. Not species, the kinds, one of each kind or each type, we would say today. He tells him to build this thing 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 300 cubits long. That's over a football field and a half in length. It's hard to picture a boat that big. It's hard to picture Noah's Ark until now. In northern Kentucky, just off I-75 near Williamstown, there's now a full-size model of Noah's Ark, complete with cages and the animal kingdom represented there and all the various kinds or types of animals that would have been on board. There's great detail about how you would go through feeding the animals, dealing with the waste, dealing with the water. So just come with me. Let's go take a look and explore the Ark Encounter. So how big is this thing? Well, it's over 500 feet long. This particular model is 510 feet long. And it's about 85 feet wide. And it's over 100 feet to the top there. About 110 feet to the top of it. 105, 110 feet to the very top. We don't know that that's exactly what it looked like, but why not? Close enough. We do know the width and the length, and even you can estimate how tall it was. And so the body of it, not counting that piece on the top, the body part right there, is around 50 feet tall, a little over 50 feet tall, just that part. But off the ground, from the ground to the top there is a little over 100 feet, the way it's sitting. So when you look at something that big, and you think about, could that float? Well, of course it could float. I mean, you almost look at that and you say, yeah, that would float. The question really was never would it float. The question is, would it stay together? And that would depend on how it was built and what kind of storms it encountered. But what's interesting, even though there are ark stories and flood stories, really flood stories, I should say it that way, there are flood stories in multiple places around the world, ancient flood stories from ancient time. The Bible is the only one that describes a story where the dimensions actually work. If you try the other boats or vessels that the people were supposedly saved in, it's usually vessels from their culture, and they really don't work when you look at the vessels. The dimensions given in the Bible actually work. They've been tested. There's actually been ships built with the scaled down proportions of that. And they do work. They work well. So, yeah, it could float. It could work. It did work. If it didn't work, we wouldn't be here. That's how I know. Here's a model of this model. Here's a scale model of this full-size model. And you can just get an idea of how it's divided up into sections. Take a look at the top, how it opens to get in air and get ventilation. And down inside we have all the animal cages. As you go down another floor, more cages. And down on another floor, here in the bottom floor, food storage, food storage. But it had to have some very interesting features also. We're going to talk about this feature right here in a bit. Features that deal with water and waste. And that's, we'll take a look at it in a second. Basically there's two different ways to put a large ship like that together. You can use all wood, which is in the first picture, just pinning it vertically and horizontally with wood. And then if you have iron, which they did have, because we know Tubal-Cain was a worker in metals and bronze, you could do partly with wooden pins and partly with iron pins. That's interesting because I've actually seen ships up into the 15 and 1800s that were still using wooden pins along with iron, so that's a reasonable possibility. So Noah's Ark had lots of animals, and people have wondered how in the world would you deal with all those animals. Well, here's a suggestion. Put them in cages. And so this is just an example of cages, watering system, and then feed troughs, that both of which are self-feeding. The watering goes down into a little area there that you fill up the bowl. There's a vacuum. It works very similar to the ones we use today to feed chickens. But as you can see, you could really put that on any scale that you want. Build that to any scale that you wanted. And of course there would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cages. Cages would have had to been all sizes, because there's all sorts of different animals. This area gives you an idea of what the interior structure would have looked like on the Ark up toward the bow or the stern, because it's rounded on both ends in this model, which would make sense because more to prevent crashing waves from impacting the boat than that it was actually going anywhere. So a round stern and a round bow helps to break the waves. And these are some of the support beams down in the center of the hull. The Bible says that it was coated inside and outside with pitch, and they've been authentic in doing that. These are the boards, but they have coated them inside and out.
This is funny.
Lots of different cages. Interestingly, that they've used clay jars. Never really thought about that, but that would make a lot of sense for small animals. All different size animals. And then you have the watering jars. Think of how much water that it would have taken to water those animals. So this is water and food storage. Lots of food storage. That's a huge issue. And how do you think Noah's family approached this? I don't think they approached it lightly after seeing the whole world being destroyed. So here's just an idea of, no doubt they would have had some sort of praise altar on board, maybe offering incense. But I think after seeing the world being destroyed all around you, it would make sense to have a place of prayer on board. Here's some examples of what food storage might have looked like. Again, food and water storage. Get an idea how big they are. people standing there. But then you would also have small animals too. So here's an example of that. They have clay pots. They can pour water through the top of them to give whatever's inside, be it salamanders or reptiles or whatever's in there. And there's a cork in the bottom to enable you to, if it gets too wet, to let some of the water out or to wash it out without releasing the animal that's inside. And that's set up on troughs that will automatically, you can see here where the waste would come out of the pot right here down into this trough, pour down, and be taken, and we'll look in a bit at the waste control system. You're on board with thousands of animals. For a year, you're going to need some, not only food, but all that food's got to go somewhere, right? So here's an interesting thing. How do you water these big animals? Well, this is an enlarged version of what we saw earlier. Water would come into this big pot and again pour out into a tray. Only this time it's a big tray, and that would allow larger animals to be able to feed. This thing's about 3 feet in diameter. And what kind of large animals do you suppose there are? Well, there's lots of kinds. One of the confusions there is with people today trying to understand the ark is they talk about species. The Bible doesn't talk about species. It talks about kinds of animals. And so there's different ancient animals that represented the ones, in other words, there wasn't 1,000 kinds of dogs. There was one kind of canine that represented and had all the genetic material to become all the various species that we recognize today. And so that's what is represented here, is all the various kinds that we find. It took a lot of research and a lot of time to go through and figure out how many kinds we were dealing with and what all they would represent. So I'm here on the bottom floor of the ark right now, and straight ahead you see a couple of the beams. But as I move here to the center of the boat, I want you to look up and you start to understand how the ventilation system worked, how the lighting system worked, and how you could have light coming down through all the different levels. So you can see the sun shining down into all the various levels of the ship. Get an idea how that maintain light and ventilation. And there's more parts to that we'll look at in a bit. This is just to give you an idea. You also see the major structural members going up through the boat here. You can see one of the main vertical beams going up through the center of the ship, and they're divided. There's a V shape. You can get an idea how big they are. You see the gentleman standing there next to it. These are huge beams. And of course, they would have been, trees this size would have been more than common in Noah's day. They're getting more rare in our day because we cut them all down. But his problem was not finding trees big enough to build something this big. His problem was cutting them and putting them all together. Okay, let's look some more. Even on Noah's Ark, you find tree huggers. Who would have thought? That gives you an idea how big that post is, that tree was. And there really would be probably seemingly no end to the food storage and the water storage. In this area of the model we see a place where the bats were. Now if there were only 2 of the unclean and 7 of the clean, being pairs or individuals, why are there so many bats? Well, it turns out that the way they made the determination, and there's actually many of the bat cages, that was just one of the vents, there's actually several of them. Turns out that the way they made the determination, how many of each kind are there, was looking at within species what species will breed together. For example, dogs, virtually every species of dog will breed with another dog. That's not the case with bats. So for now, the only choice was to have lots and lots of bats. So there's actually over 300 bats in this version. Fortunately, bats are small, and even some of them are tiny. There's a little tiny guy right there. So they don't take up a lot of room. At this point, we've actually just walked through the bottom of the ship. We're looking at we started in the stern and now we're up in the bow, and you just see these massive structures going up. Remember, this thing's about a football and a half field long. About a football and a half field long. A half field, is that a word? It is now. Anyway, so we're going to take a look. We're going to go up one level and take a look at what's up in some upper levels now. In this life-size model, they were using ramps to go up between the floors, which would make a lot of sense. You could move animals that way. You could move food that way. We could move a lot of waste, whatever you need, and people, whatever you needed to haul. You could move it up and down that way. They probably wouldn't have needed hauls this big. We're approaching the bow on the second level. You get an idea of what the structure would have looked like. And also, here's some more friendly animals. So they would have been taking care of them.
This is my cow.
That's your cow?
Yeah, his name's Moses. He's actually a miniature cow.
Okay.
He has Rahim, Dexter, and Puffin in him.
Good. I always found it fascinating that these donkeys have a cross on their back.
The Jerusalem, Mediterranean.
Yeah. And an attitude. So it would have been interesting. They would have had places to take care of animals that were sick that they needed to take out and take care of them personally, and that's what that would represent. And then there's the structure, more the idea of the structure plus light coming in from the top. What was it like in the beginning? God created everything in 6 days. Good. Here's some more examples of the different kinds of animals. These are based on fossilized animals where they took the skeletons of fossilized animals and then artistically created what the animal would have looked like. Of course, some of them look very much like they look today, especially if you live where we do. Now you can see the watering system that we saw, a small version. This is a larger version. I'm going to show more about how that works in a minute. But for now, I realize that the water comes in from the top, and then goes down to the bottom, and there's a control that allows them to let the water in the bottom, where big cats and big animals would drink.
The construction phase has been the last 15 years or so. We had to clear the forest for trees. It's about the timber that we should decide. Also, here's the sheep, the wood our sculpture. It takes time.
So there's how they would have put the water in, come down into the, or that's feed actually. Be putting feed in that would come down into the feed trough, come down into the pipe. Because you feed the animals. Of course, these are big animals. You don't want to get in with them, get stepped on. All the animals would not have been big. They would be small versions of the big animals. And there's their watering system and behind it, how that would have worked. So from the deck above, he can control the water and the feed without having to go around the outside. He can just go across the top and feed many of them at one time. One of the things we don't think about is that the cages, the animals, there would have had to been repair going on the Ark. So there would have been people doing maintenance work just like there is on any ship. Any big ship has machine shops, places where they can do repairs. So no doubt the Ark would have had that as well. I like this guy's shoes. Pretty cool, made from leather, but very interesting. The way he folded them from the bottom and tied them on there, it's kind of neat. Of course, we know that in Genesis before the flood, in Genesis chapter 4, it talks about Tubal-Cain being a worker of metal, and so no doubt they would have had a metal shop on board as well. And again, every modern ship and every ancient ship had that way to do blacksmithing. So the Ark would likely have had that as well. You know, the point of this life-size model, filled with the actual number of animals, showing that this is more than just a possibility, that it really did happen. It's very realistic. It's a very reasonable thing. But really, if you think about it, the world does not portray it that way, and we don't portray it to our kids that way. And believers in the Bible have bought into the idea of telling kids that we don't tell them directly that it's a fairy tale. We actually tell them that it's true. But then we present it as a fairy tale. And all the books, all the secular books, is presented as a fairy tale. So I'm going to look at that idea. I want to explore that idea. We're going to break away from this for just a second and look at that idea. The world has been presented, and we present our kids with the idea of a fairy tale ark. And here's an example of that. If you look at the collection of books in here, every one of them is presented as a fairy tale. Think about that. If you grow up with kids believing that it's all just toys from the time they're infants, are they going to think this is a real story? So what are we doing when we present that? We're disregarding the word. We're distorting the message and making it deceptively cute. Is that the truth? Genesis 7:23 says, and everyone except the people on the ark died. Think about how it's presented to the kids. Look at all the books. It's a collection of books showing how much deception there is in the world. This is what your kids grow up seeing. And the reality is, we have an enemy. And if he can convince you that the flood was not real, he can convince you that heaven and hell are not real as well. Think about that. Okay, so here's an example of how the clean water system would work, rain catching system. Rain comes in, fills up these tanks that are sitting there, and they open the valve. It goes in and fills up the water trough that the animals eat from. That can flow through some pipes down to some other ones, and they just continue that process. The other thing they have to deal with is a lot of liquid waste with all the animals. So here's an example of how that could work. We've got the waste, as we've seen before, was draining from the animals' cages, and it would drain and pour into this pool that's in the center of the boat, called a moon pool, which actually takes some of the stress off the boat and helps it to be stable. Waves come up and down in the pool. That helps stabilize the boat. Moon pool is a well-known marine design in big vessels. The next thing we have to deal with is solid waste removal, which would end up down at the bottom. So various places it might end up or originate, they would dump it down to the bottom, and then it could be put into a system. I like to have the elephant there running the little wheel, and then it would travel up, be dumped once again into the moon pool, which is dumping it into the ocean. It's interesting that pulsing action also helps create airflow inside the ark. We're going to look at another system here in a second, design the airflow, a positive airflow system. So other than just the wind and the waves, you could actually create with a moon pool. If you put some vents up at the top, just some flapper vents, as you see they have flapper vents right in here that open and close. As the waves go up and down, provides the power, the waves going up and down in the pool, provides the power to power positive airflow throughout the ark. Another reasonable, so there's a lot of reasonable things that could have done. Obviously you're going to have some natural convection and flow with the ventilation, but you could create positive airflow really easy. The other question that comes up is how you can do lights, and there's several, once again, there's several things you could do for light. You could start out, you could have artificial light. You could actually have lamps in there. They light lamps. That makes sense. You have, you use olive oil in jars, big olive oil lamps. The other thing you could do is, of course, it has a place on the top that can be opened, so they could go up and open those, just manually open those, and when they do, light would flow down inside the ark. Think about that. And we see that in this model. It actually does that here. Sunlight we saw today was flowing through the whole thing. The other thing, if you open it straight from the top, of course, then you get a lot of light all down through it, because the center would be open, much like the life-size model here. Here's a cutaway of how that water flow, freshwater system would work. And actually they all could work. This particular one is the freshwater system, but it would come in off the roof and flow down through pipes and pour into the catchment vessel, which is here. And right here, there's a stopper that would keep trash out of it. So they open the stopper, allow it to fill. You can see the cutaway of how it would work. So this is inside it. And the color there at the bottom represents the water. And then the bowl that it would have poured out into. Now, you can do a lot of things that way. This is an example of how the food storage would have went, the grain storage. Here's an example of cages, for example, that have been damaged. They would have had to maintain those. There's a cutaway of the food system, how it would have worked. This is important to recognize. We just looked at how the waste product would get down to the bottom. And here's a drawing of how that whole thing could work. You just have all the cages lined up so that the waste would drop down through the center, down through here. It would drop right there and right there out of this cage, and this cage would drop all the way down to the bottom. And then there at the bottom hit something, go out that could be removed. Very easy. Simple stuff. A lot of things could be done. It's not complicated. So what was the ark? It was a lot. Ark is a place of safety. Ark is a place where God preserved all the life from the earth. So, is it a boat full of cages? For sure. It's a boat full of animals. It's a boat full of life. God is about life. He's about restoring life. All the kinds. That's the key. All the kinds, that's the word. This is the sloth kind. So, the question is, how many kinds? I mean, there's lions, there's tigers, there's bears, there's every species that we think of today is represented here. The father of his species is here. How many? Well, according to their calculations and the researchers that have worked on it, there's just under 1,400 kinds. In fact, 1,398. And this represents the bear kind. All total on the animals, and they did a worst case scenario, there's 6,744 animals were on the ark. It could well have been less, but that's how they calculated it. Worst case scenario, not best case scenario. How much food does it take? There's over 400 tons of food stored in 15,000 vessels, because this guy's going to get hungry. How much water? It's calculated that there would be 322,000 gallons of water needed. And so they did calculations for the storage of 285,000 gallons of stored water, and the rest they caught from the rainwater. If anybody who's spent any time at sea knows you can't count on rainwater for your main supply. So the ark is a lot of things, but the biggest thing it is the overriding principle of the Torah, the overriding principle of the Bible. The clean and the unclean alike. It's about preserving life, all kinds of life. And that's why God had Noah build this big boat, to preserve life. So we've looked at all the cages and all the animals and talked about their food. What we haven't talked about is the food for Noah. You know, they were on this thing for a year, over a year. So do you think they just ate grain? Well, think about it. They had to do stuff like take care of their clothing, so there would have been places to do that. But remember, they have light, they have water, and so why couldn't they have grown greens? Why couldn't they have grown stuff up near the top of the ark where there's a lot of light coming in? Why would they not have had plants and had a garden? A boat this big, it would actually be very easy. They could have had all sorts of gardens. Okay? So this system, by the way, is not uncommon on larger vessels today. They can grow stuff up on the top decks. And we're near the top. We're on the second one down. We're not on the very top. But they could have grown their own vegetables. You know, just had at least enough to have get some vitamin C, some vitamin A. You want your vitamin C, right? You don't want to get scurvy. And the Bible doesn't say they got scurvy, so they knew how to eat right. Makes sense. They would have not only had their storage food. When you think about it, Noah is sort of like the ultimate prepper, right? Yeah, so they would have had, you know, they could have grown plants, dried their seeds, had their herbs. These are all herbs. And then, of course, they would have had to prepare those depending on what they were doing. So there would have been food preparation areas. They had kitchens, and there's garlic and leeks and onions drying in the background, potatoes. Well, that's not potatoes, that's squash, pumpkin squash. But they had to eat, so no reason. The animals are eating well, and they're having to work really hard taking care of the animals. There's no reason, whatever, that they wouldn't have had good food as well. So it just makes sense. It's something we don't think about a lot, but it is something I'm sure they thought about a lot. And of course you would have had to have a place to cook, right? And there's been pots and pans, and of course clay, and the clay ovens, ancient clay ovens, is the way that was done in ancient times. Big clay oven, invented, all built out of clay, invented out. And then living quarters. We don't think much about that. They would have had to have living quarters as well. So we would have found meeting places, living quarters, places to get together and have conversations, sit together, have soup or tea or whatever, or maybe even some fresh beans that came from their hydroponic system, came from their she looked kind of excited, like, what have you got? You got more beans for me to shell? Sitting there shelling peas, shelling beans, like, oh, no, he come in with another basket. Thank you very much. Have to have shelled beans or peas to appreciate that. But of course there would have been living quarters. And this is just an example of what it, you know, of course this is all what it could have looked like. And of course up on the top floor where there was more light, more wind, more air, that's where the birds were kept. So we would have found birds. And I suppose just like in any aviary we have today, sometimes one would get out. And then one time they let one out, right? And so maybe that's Noah letting the bird out to go see. If you look closely at this bird, look what he has in his mouth. Oh, looks like an olive branch. That means there's dry land, right? flood is over. Maybe that's why the birds are so excited. That dove with the olive branch is a great way to end this story, because the story of Noah's Ark is really not about destruction. It's about life. It's about the preservation of life. It's about the restoration of life. The wicked will be destroyed in the end. That's what Scripture teaches. But that's not God's goal. Messiah came that we would have life and have it more abundantly. The dove came back bringing an olive branch, a symbol of peace, a symbol of life. You see the hand of Noah there reaching up to catch the bird. We see the hand of Messiah reaching out to reach for us. Noah's Ark is about life. Messiah is about life, and life more abundantly. I hope you'd enjoyed this. We enjoyed making it, we enjoyed being here, and we enjoyed sharing it with you. Thank you, and shalom. Do you guys know how many of you there was on the ark? You know? There was 2 because you're unclean. I didn't mean to offend you. You took it personally. Sorry.